Welcome. Thursday live stream. It's the quarantine streams on Thursday. This Sunday, third part of our new Sunday series, we're talking with Pepe Escobar of the Asia Times about China and multipolarity. And today, we have our good buddy and regular contributor, Daniel Bessner, who's, of course, an associate professor of American foreign policy at the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington, non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and, of course, author of Hans Speyer and the Rise of the Defense Intellectuals. Daniel Bessner, thanks so much for being here, man.
Thanks so much for having me, Michael. I have a new appellation. I've recently been made a contributing editor at Jacobin too. So yeah. Oh,
that's fantastic. I guess we're both newly officially affiliated with Jacobin.
Yeah, the revolution is happening.
That's right. Finally, it makes sense that you and I move in tandem. I think that's fitting. Of course, go to patreon.com/TNBS, become a patron. If you're watching this, feel free to hit us with a super chat, hit like, do all that stuff. Shopkeeping or housekeeping or whatever out of the way. Daniel Bessner, we're talking about a piece that you wrote, and this is going to be one of two parts for Jacobin. The last thing we need is a new Cold War with China. Want to get to the current trajectory, and we've been talking about China a lot more on this show, mainly from the perspective of resisting this bloodlust that's being drummed up that you're writing about, but also from the perspective of trying to figure out where China's coming from too, as best we can, which is pretty limited. But before we get there, can we do a hit? I mean, no one's better at this than you. Just kind of a history that echoes coming back of basically the U.S. national security state as an infrastructure, and how our first Cold War, hopefully we're not entering a second one, created everything from the National Security Council itself to hundreds of bases across the world. It's like the actual bureaucratic structure of U.S. imperialism. How does that work? What's that history?
Sure. So I think the history begins in the 1930s, and particularly around the experience of American elites with fascism. And what's so important about that encounter, obviously there's a lot going on, but to drum it down, it's that fascism appeared as an ideological competitor to democratic liberal capitalism that had a very strong military state behind it. And so it was over the course of the 1930s that I think, at least, that U.S. elites began to view the fight with fascism as a Manichaean existential struggle for the future of the world. So what happens, of course, during World War II is that in 1940, the summer of 1940, France falls to the Nazis. And this, historians, and particularly Stephen Wertheim in his forthcoming book, Tomorrow the World, argue that this is really the moment when elite Americans decided to rule the world, to govern the world, to become the prime nation in the world. So what you have over the course of World War II is two streams. One, a stream of thought that argues that international politics is best understood as a Manichaean struggle against existential enemies. At this point, they meant the Nazis. And another stream that said world peace and prosperity must depend on the United States becoming the prime nation in the world. And so at the end of World War II, and particularly with the rise of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, so what American elites did was that they began to transfer their anxieties about Nazism onto the Soviet Union, which was another dictatorial regime, which did seem like an ideological competitor to the United States. It certainly was, but was probably not an I think it wasn't. I'll just say I don't think it was an existential threat to the United States, but nevertheless, American elites began to view the Soviet Union as analogous to fascism before them, and they at the same time believed that the United States needed to govern the world. So what happened in the late 1940s was that American elites, to basically dominate the world and combat the Soviet Union, created what might be called the infrastructure of empire. So this includes things like the military-industrial complex, Douglas Aircraft Company, Boeing, all these companies started to become defense contractors and really spend a lot of their money on defense. And then they also created the architecture of empire in the bureaucratic state that is in the White House with institutions like the National Security Council, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Department of Defense, later the National Security Agency. They did this in the 1947 National Security Act on one hand. So you have official government structures of empire on one hand, and then you have what I like to think of as parastate institutions that support these government structures, like think tanks, diversity of think tanks, academic research centers, that together provide the intellectual infrastructure of American empire. And basically, these two elements, both the institutions of the state and the institutions of this sort of parastate, and we should add a third element, the military-industrial complex, are basically the structures that continue to shape American foreign policy today. Moreover, I think at least that those two very large ideological constructs, one, that international politics is always a Manichaean struggle between good and evil, and that the United States needs to dominate the world, is essentially what we consider to be mainstream foreign policy thought. And the danger is that, much like with the Soviet Union before it, any new Cold War with China will risk analogizing China to regimes to which it's not really analogous, and we could get into another decades-long, expensive, and extremely destructive in terms of human life and everything surrounding it, new Cold War.
So this is important. Maybe I guess just mute while I'm not sure how to handle it on my end with the echo, but on your end with the echo. But how much of this is the initial creation of the national security state is organic in the sense that there is in some ways an exceptional historical event, not World War II. We already had World War I, and there's a lot of trends that could lead to something like World War II. But the Nazi project is unique, and it is appropriately thought of, and I think you and I agree with it as, in fact, an almost one-of-a-kind historical horror because of obviously the project itself and also its capacity. So even governments or movements that might have similarly all-encompassing genocidal agendas, they don't have the capacity to invade half of Europe. So you talk about these intellectuals that helped give rise to the national security state who were sincerely traumatized by Nazism, like Hans Speyer. That's one element of it. But on the other hand, how much of this is the sort of intellectual infrastructure over something that would have happened anyways, which is that the UK is the British Empire is in decline. We still want a Western-dominated market system that keeps the core rules of capitalist production and hegemony and the center exploiting the periphery into place. And now we just have to pass the baton onto a new imperial system with the United States. And that's sort of an inevitability, including, of course, the aggression with the Soviet Union, because it's the only main geopolitical competitor. And it does represent, even with all of its flaws and internal contradictions, a different ideological path.
I think I think all of that is right. I think we have to remember, just in terms of Germany, Germany was the industrial powerhouse of Europe and had been for quite a long time. And pre-World War II Germany extends into what is now Poland. So it's about double the size of what Germany is now. And Germany now is already incredibly powerful, now double that essentially. So it just had more capacity than the Soviet Union, sort of a still largely agrarian society over the course of the 20s, 30s, and 40s did to wage a war. So I think you're right. I think that if one is to basically assign primary causal weight to why world politics turned out as it did in the period after 1945, I would say it's because U.S. policymakers decided to govern the world. But the peculiar form that dominance took was very much and very early on shaped by the Cold War. So the type of regimes that the United States funneled money to, the types of wars that they got in, the types of defense programs and domestic propaganda that they did was all shaped by the Cold War. But I do think, as a counterfactual, I do think the United States would have tried to take over the world. But it was the Cold War that made that attempt at domination more violent more vicious, and especially more ideological than it would have otherwise been. So, for example, I think when we're talking about domestic politics, I think that socialism wouldn't have been quite as moribund after World War II, absent the Cold War. I'm not sure labor would have taken the particularly conservative turns that it did after the war. I'm not sure the government would have focused so obsessively about destroying communism and destroying socialism. So I think like that could have been, you could have seen the United States attempt at domination while also a domestic socialist movement, but things like the Cold War made that impossible. So I do agree with you, and I do think that the character would have been different, though, absent a Cold War.
And maybe actually also absent the unique traumas that some of the European intellectuals had around Nazism, which is what your book is about. And so I want you to bring us to today, where what has shocked me, not that people have criticisms of China, not that people have xenophobia, but that people have actually started to compare the People's Republic to Nazi Germany. As a standalone, that's a pretty extraordinary and crazy statement. And it's maybe even more dangerous than it appears. And I'm wondering if you could use the history of specifically that type of argumentation, using that kind of state of exception with Nazism, not only through the Cold War, but also to reify the US hegemonic state post-Cold War in the 1990s.
Sure. I think that's a really great question. So I think one thing that one wants to highlight is that Americans deploy the Nazi analogy constantly throughout the entirety of the Cold War, throughout the last 30 years. And if people, around our age will remember that in the early 2000s, Iran was called Nazi, Iraq was called Nazi, North Korea was called Nazi, Venezuela was called Nazi. So this is something that is a very important metaphor in American political discourse. But why I think it's more than just rhetoric, is that it really has in the past and will likely continue to have real important effects on the structure of American foreign policy and American foreign policy making. So all the institutional networks that I just talked about, the National Security Council, think tanks, the military-industrial complex, they form a peculiar part of the mid-century state. So what happened at the mid-century is, the modern state that we are all familiar with in our lives is really a creation of World War II. And one of the decisions that was made during and after World War II is that a lot of the institutions that make and define and think about foreign policy would be anti-democratic in the sense that they would be almost totally insulated from public opinion. The executive could essentially do what they want, but even insulated from congressional opinion, where the executive could deploy troops for, I think technically it was only a couple of months, but in actuality it went to whatever they wanted to, however the executive saw fit. And of course, the famous thing, I definitely have said it on here before, I think the last time the United States has officially declared war is 1942, and if I recall correctly, it's against Romania or Bulgaria, I think Romania. So we could see how foreign policy making, by virtue of being centered in the White House, is an incredibly undemocratic thing. And that was justified because Americans argued at the mid-century that the Soviet Union was akin to Nazism, and the only way to defeat such an existential threat is you had to make sure that basically the idiot public didn't try to make the United States not do what was in their best interest, which is fight the Cold War. And that's always, I think, been the source of the power of that metaphor, of the metaphor of the Nazi, particularly as elites deploy it, because what it essentially does, it allows them to do what they want without any reference to public or even congressional opinion. So that's one aspect. And then the other aspect is, I think the rhetoric does make Americans generally promote a more interventionist foreign policy. Like you had just mentioned, there was actually a world historical threat in Germany in its industrial capacity. And should Germany have developed, for example, the atomic bomb, could really have posed a serious threat to international peace and a genocidal ideology behind it. The problem is that though we've had other genocidal maniacs in history, and I don't want to deny that, diversity of people, never has sort of industrial capacity been married to genocidal ideology in quite the same way. And it wasn't married in that way in the Soviet Union, and it's certainly not married that way with regard to People's Republic of China. However, using that metaphor allows people to believe that it in fact does, which promotes the very sorts of structures and very sorts of foreign policies that you and I consider to be incredibly problematic.
Right. So how is talk about how you're seeing, again, as a contemporary analyst and as a historian, the drumbeat that's happening now. Where's it coming from? What does it look like when the think tank infrastructure, when public intellectuals and policy entrepreneurs, I talked about on Tuesday, it cannot be denied that certainly some of the think tanks pushing this much more aggressive agenda, it's pretty raw. I mean, they do take funding from Raytheon, from Boeing, from, General Dynamics. How does that, how is like conventional wisdom start to take shape? Because I want people to understand that even though it's accelerating post-COVID, this had already been happening for the last couple of years. This idea of even like the pivot to Asia under Obama.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I just want to say, like, all the things that I talked about are also mixing with the long history of anti-Asian racism in the United States, going back to the 19th century, when a number of people from East Asia and Southeast Asia and throughout the Asian continent were basically labored in the United States and built the infrastructure of the American West, which was accompanied to a very significant degree by a lot of anti-Asian racism, culminating in things like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which effectively barred immigration from China, the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan, of 1907, which effectively did the same thing, and also the fact that basically people of Asian descent couldn't become American citizens until the early 1950s. So we can't ignore this like long history of anti-Asian racism in which Asian people are compared to a virus and fifth column within America, in actually significant parallels to anti-Semitic propaganda from around the same time. So that's always a little backdrop to here. But in terms of the what you're talking about specifically in the more recent context, I think that one of the most important things to understand about the last 30 years of history in the United States is that we see something peculiar. With that, the end of the Cold War and the end of what might be called the justifying logic of the military-industrial complex and the military-intellectual complex, these institutions have nevertheless continued to exist, right? So the era, famously, of the 90s, the United States as the indispensable nation, in the 2000s sort of unilateral Bush move, and then after that with Obama sort of making war more clean. Throughout that entire era, the institutions and structures that make American foreign policy have essentially been searching for a justifying logic, let's put it. So in the 1990s, people try to make it humanitarian intervention. There's a rise of sort of Holocaust memory. People like Samantha Power in the early 2000s, but she really made her career in the 1990s, are arguing that the justifying logic of the United States would be to make the world safe for democracy. We'll go around killing dictators and saving innocents, right? That's the justifying logic of keeping the American military structure going. Then after that, of course, you have the attacks of 9/11, and the justifying logic switches from the responsibility to protect or humanitarian intervention to, there's still an element of it there, but it really switches to kind of anti-terrorism, right? And so with Iraq, there's discussions of democratizing Iraq, but you really get what I would say the so-called global war on terror is the new justifying logic for American empire in the world. And you see also with the global war on terror, the deployment of the Nazi analogy, where Iraq is compared to Nazis, Bin Laden is compared to the Nazis, the Taliban is compared to the Nazis. So that's also operating. And then eventually, I would say by the late aughts, by the early Obama administration, sort of like late term Obama first administration, it's pretty clear that that logic isn't as prominent. That people just aren't buying that ISIS is an existential threat to humanity. The trauma of 9/11 has faded into the past. It was a decade ago. And so you begin to get what I think you referenced with the Obama pivot to Asia is a new justifying logic for the military-industrial complex, military-intellectual complex, which is this new Cold War with China. That the idea and the prominence in the 80s and 90s, particularly after the end of the Cold War, was that free trade and liberalization will eventually force China to become essentially a liberal capitalist democracy. What actually happened was that China became capitalist but not democratic. And so you begin to see the disillusionment with that idea being replaced with this idea of China as a global peer competitor. Not only a peer competitor, but an authoritarian regime that's analogous to the Soviet Union and eventually the Nazis, and that this has become the new justifying logic of the American empire. And you see it across the political spectrum with the famous Biden ad from a couple of years ago, with Trump referring to the Chinese virus, and although supporters of both Biden and Trump basically coming together over this anti-Chinese rhetoric. And so what I try to do, and what I think places like the Quincy Institute try to do, and heterodox critics, left-wing critics, even libertarian critics of U.S. foreign policy try to do, is to prevent this sort of conglomeration of what might be called respectable opinion around this new Cold War with China.
So I want to get actually specifically to some of China's rise in the world on its own terms in a few minutes, but setting aside, like no question, especially with something as serious as this, as a Cold War with China, or a coup in Venezuela, or the U.S. policy towards Iran. I mean, of course, there should be a coalition across any political metric of people who, have a grounded opposition, including, libertarian anti-interventionists and people who might identify as realists and who want a more restrained foreign policy for their perception of national interest. But I am curious from a socialist viewpoint. Would it be possible to I'm sorry, I don't know why I'm having so much trouble articulating this, but as long as China is a sweatshop, essentially, and a subsidiary of the United States, that's fine. We can do that. As soon as it rises as a peer competitor, it threatens supply chains. It threatens zones of influence, and to me, that goes inside the dynamic tension in people that practically, of course, we should align with, but in a broader sense of how we actually pull back from these policies, how much does just the nature of capitalist production become an issue here? And also start to show you maybe why it isn't as simple as, just being rational. Because of course, on one level, it's totally irrational to be aggressive with China. And obviously there's business deals to be made there. In fact, our supply chains are entirely reliant on them, even as people are on TV every night demanding an escalation. So at what point in the tension inside a kind of anti-interventionist position itself, again, not at all to create division and exclude people, not work with people, practically, that's incredibly important. We welcome that. But as a theoretical model for how we get out of this, what is the capitalist dimension of understanding what's happening here?
Well, I think it's pretty clear. I think if you're a pro-market person, you want a couple of things. You want the U.S. dollar to remain the global reserve currency, and you want China to essentially serve as the material base for the service economy of the United States. So I think that is going to be inherently a tension, sort of what comes after if we avoid a new Cold War. How do we sort of take out the economic sinews of empire, which rely on things like China being a sweatshop, and the not certainly wouldn't be in favor of monetary multilateralism or anything along those lines. So I think that is definitely a tension in sort of the anti-imperialist alliance going to probably need to be worked out in the coming years. And I also think it's important to emphasize that in terms of China's growing power, just to see what position they're in, I don't think China necessarily wants to become a service economy. I don't think they're having any great plans right now to do anything what they've been doing, which is in manufacturing and some raw material base. And I think that's why you see them trying to expand into Africa, which is to basically shore up raw materials that could continue to fund sort of the manufacturing-based economy. But what I do think, I think that in some sense the Chinese Communist Party elite and the American capitalist elite agree on that fundamental relationship, at least at this point. I think what you see in things like the Asian Infrastructure and Development Bank, the Belt and Silk Road, and the Belt and Silk Road Initiative, and things along those lines, is that China is also trying to carve out an economic and security space for itself within East Asia, broadly speaking. So I think, if you're thinking about what China's looking at in terms of security, you basically have a ring of American bases and alliances surrounding it. And so my guess would be that one of the things that the Communist Party wants to do in the coming years is to begin to push the United States both on certain issues like Hong Kong, which they've already been doing, and Taiwan and the South China Sea, which they've already been doing. But I wouldn't be surprised if they begin to push in the next 10, 15 years on things like the alliance with South Korea, the American troops there, the alliance with Japan, and things along those lines. So I think the United States and what socialists need to do is articulate what they consider an exit from East Asia to look like. Does that involve security commitments to places like Taiwan, Japan, or South Korea? Does that involve some sort of security transition where the United States essentially abandons alliances and said they're on their own and they have to make peace with China? And I think there's really no good answers there, but it's something that we need to consider to take seriously.
Yeah, I mean, there's a paradox there in terms of my own politics, because I was talking with Guillaume Long earlier, who was Ecuador's former foreign minister, and he was making the point correctly, in my view, that of course he was developing relationships with China and diversifying diplomatic and business engagement, because the pink tide project starting with redistribution and breaking the neoliberal model was, and you couldn't do that without creating some independence from the United States. And part of how you create independence, if you're in the periphery, is by building relationships with another, in this case, emerging power. That's a no-brainer. But where I think sometimes, people on the left get, cross with me, I have no problem saying that the United States is absolutely the world's hegemon, and therefore, as a direct consequence, the most militaristic, dangerous actor on the planet. I absolutely. But I also, for the same reason that I strongly encourage, Ecuador partnering with China, I think it's very shrewd that Vietnam, engages in direct relationships with the United States. That's, and builds out a diversity of its own business relationships and supply chains, because that's a very smart thing to do if you want to maintain independence in what could become, a Chinese hegemonic sphere. So actually, let me just leave it at that. What do you think of if we looked at politics, if we looked at the goal of the international system as obviously to get away from US hegemony, and there's innate value in having one strategic competitor, which we can get to maybe at the end when we talk about multiple currencies and some of the benefits of Belt and Road, which we've talked about on the show. And at the same time, when we think it from the perspective of being in the U.S. center, I want the same logic of Guillaume Long's engagement with China to be applicable to, a Vietnamese or Indonesian or even Japanese. I mean, obviously Japan's on a different place in the totem pole, but anyways, you get my point. How would you kind of balance those dynamics out?
I think that's a really good question. And I just want to, point to our listeners that Vietnam and China have long had a lot of disagreements, fighting in the 1970s. And you could even argue that in the 70s and 80s, Vietnam really made a bid for United Vietnam made a bid for hegemony across Asia. It didn't come to fruition, but there's long been tensions between China and Vietnam. The revolutionary communist movement basically fell apart by the 70s, and at least on the state level. And it's not particularly surprising that Vietnam is intending to work with the United States. And so I think, ideally, maybe I'm alone here, but my utopia would be some sort of one world democratic government, right, where every individual gets, relative access to the same goods and opportunities as anyone else. But the question is, how do you get there? And I think in the short term, what you suggested is you have to take the American empire down. However, as you also suggested, if you're Vietnam or Japan or South Korea, and there's not a particularly friendly China, which
or Taiwan. I mean, let's include Taiwan. Like the security guarantee is problematic. At the same time, we have to acknowledge the incredible gains that Taiwan has made.
Absolutely, and then it becomes about a series of bad decisions. Right? Like, do you want the United States to maintain the military capacity to defend Taiwan should China try to cross the straits? Or are you willing to say we're not going to fight World War III over that, and we don't it's not a problem therefore to destroy our military capacity there. This is why what I personally advocate for in the region is some sort of security transition. where, American allies aren't just abandoned to the Chinese juggernaut, though they are forced to accommodate the reality of a Chinese sphere of influence or Chinese power. So for me, that's where I've come after thinking about this. But that's abandoning Taiwan, that's abandoning Hong Kong, that's abandoning, South Korea in some way, that's abandoning Japan. Now, I think these countries, just like the countries in Western Europe, are powerful enough and should, as an issue of sovereignty, come to their own policies absent the U.S. hegemon. So I don't necessarily view it as abandoning. But some might view it in that regard. And for example, whenever I talk about U.S. intervention, I've oftentimes gotten angry emails from Hong Kong democracy protesters. Right? They're like, "What do you think? The United States shouldn't aid Hong Kong?" And like it's a terrible thing to say. Or the United States shouldn't aid the Kurds. Right? Even we created that terrible. So then it's a series of bad decisions that I think will be aided by the left building organic connections to movements on the ground. But at the same time, at some point, the American military empire, if it wants to it'll have to devolve itself. And when it devolves itself, it won't be able to commit as strongly to so-called good projects. And that's just the reality of the situation as far as I see it.
What kind of potential do you see arising out of the Asian development projects, alternative banking, even currency projects, and Belt and Road, from the perspective of not glorifying another power block, but again, like Lula said, his vision of BRICS was to create an alternative currency source to basically do not only things that were an alternative from the policy sets of the Washington Consensus, but start to create the physical infrastructure of that. And it is happening right now to some extent. What do you think the opportunity is there?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Well, I would say always middle and smaller powers benefit from having more options. So throughout the Cold War, as a lot of recent historiography has demonstrated, places like India and Pakistan would play the Soviet Union and the United States off each other and therefore receive significant aid. Oftentimes, unfortunately, this was military aid, but there's no reason it couldn't be geared towards something like a development project or electricity or vaccinations or things along those lines. The problem is, as the historiography on development has also demonstrated, development projects often fail and often wind up perverting organic developments and are seized by elites. So it's not like development is a panacea for anything. There's a lot of contradictions in there. And ultimately, I think an international structure in which the global north is at the top and the global south is at the bottom is not going to be really attacked by development projects at the margins. But that's really a story for another time. What's interesting, though, about the development projects that you mentioned that China has pursued, I mean, I'm no expert, but my understanding is, unlike American and Soviet development projects in the past, is that they're often using Chinese workers themselves who kind of parachute in, build plants or build dams or whatever it may be, and then reap a lot of the benefits from these development projects that are not as distributed as democratically amongst local populations. And I don't know, you've seen Uncut Gems, right? That first scene, it's that first scene. It's over Chinese company, right? So using African workers, but also run by China. So it remains to be seen whether those sorts of development initiatives are actually going to result in pro-Chinese sentiment. My guess is no. And then it remains to be seen how important that is or isn't.
And you've also, the last thing for this conversation before we'll get off and then we'll record the Patreon episode and go into much more detail about the sort of practical dismantling of the national security state and what a democratic and worker-oriented foreign policy would actually look like. But you've made this point before, which, and you don't mean it as an evasion from asking a hard question like what happens to Taiwan or, how to balance competing demands and interests in a place like Hong Kong or whatever else. But you've actually, if I interpret you correctly, you've said that even just the sort of fact that foreign policy in popular cultural discourse always gets reduced to, well, what would happen or what would you do about fill in the blank crisis? That is the wrong frame. Like that, if you set questions like that, you're inevitably going to recreate basically dominant U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah, and so the basic point that I always make is that those thought experiment questions assume U.S. military primacy, assume the United States acts are right in the right to act in the world, and the questions that we should really be asking is how do we change structure so that we don't have those crises, right? So it's to go to a deeper level of analysis that I think then we could see the real materialist ideological structures that undergird these crises, and then you could prevent them from happening in the short and medium term. Because if we continue focusing on the crisis itself, we'll inevitably reproduce military hegemony and the militaristic culture that we have.
Great. All right. Well, Daniel Bessner, I appreciate it as always. People can read you in Jacobin. They can also read you at the Quincy Institute. I'd also definitely read Eli Clifton's investigative reporting over there. He's doing great work. He's a really, really good journalist over there at the Responsible Statecraft blog. And of course, check out Daniel's book, Honchfire and the Rise of Defense Intellectuals. That's a very, very important book for understanding how all this stuff comes together. Daniel, we'll take a break and we'll go record the Patreon episode. Folks, patreon.com/TMBS, Sunday, Pepe Escobar. And of course, next Tuesday, we're back. All right, take good care.